It's finally that time of year where we can all enjoy ghost stories and spooky things like spying elves and old men who want to watch to see whether you are naughty or nice. Yes, it's finally Christmas. So let's gather round the dead tree you put in your house and tell some scary ghost stories. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know it scares you.
Hi, I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the ninth episode in season three, and it is Christmas time again. All right. Before we get started in our discussion, I just want to first say that, as you guys could probably tell from the intro, Matt is not with us tonight. He was feeling under the weather, so sadly, it'll just be Lisa and me on this recording. Not that I don't love recording with Lisa, but it's always kind of sad we can't have all three of us here for the discussion. The second thing I wanted to say before we get into our discussion is if you guys are interested in Christmas horror, we have two seasons before this one where we've talked about it before. So we did a Christmas episode, our first season, where we had a Charles Dickens scholar on with us, Sherry, and we talked about A Christmas Carol and some of his other ghostly Christmas stories, since Charles Dickens is mostly associated in our minds probably with Christmas ghosts. So there were many other writers at the time of him writing these sorts of things. And the other thing is, I believe our first season we did a mini episode that we released to everyone. We do mini episodes on Patreon. If you support us as a Patreon supporter, $5 a month, you get extra bonus content and conversations in the weeks between our main eps. And we did a mini episode on Christmas horror kind of around the world where we talked about Krampus and the Yule Cat and Gorilla and various other Christmas horrors in other countries and traditions that we have brought with us to America. And I believe our last Patreon episode, if I remember correctly, in this season was about Christmas haunted houses and how that's a new phenomenon. So there's other episodes y'all can check out if you're interested in this topic. So Merry Christmas. As I think we've talked about before, ghosts don't just stop haunting us on Halloween. They hang around all winter. For instance, this song, The Most Wonderful Time of the Year, talks about the scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. Telling Christmas ghost stories, particularly in the night of Christmas Eve, has been a tradition for a long time. And while it probably has been going on much longer than the Victorian age, during the Victorian age, when a lot of our traditions of Christmas became a thing, people weren't really celebrating Christmas that regularly in the Victorian time period. And so some of our traditions got pulled from other places and kind of formed then. From the Christmas tree to present giving and, using stories to kind of teach morals and charity during the time period and that sort of thing. But this idea of the dark winter nights and the cold and all of that kind of lent itself, I would say, probably to the penchant for people telling ghost stories. And the Victorians just kind of ran with it so they could make money selling their Christmas annuals. With lots of Christmas ghost stories in them. That's kind of my take, Lisa. I know you said you want to bring back Ghost Story at Christmas time.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like we need to bring back the ghost story at Christmas time. I mean, precisely for the reasons that you were talking about, Mel, because like I'm sitting here as we're recording this and it is in December and of course it got dark around my house way too early and it's cold and probably not as cold as it is in some parts of the country, but for me it is very cold outside. And it's just kind of rainy and dreary and gross, and it's the exact kind of weather that makes me at least want to wrap up in a big cozy blanket with like a cup of tea and never move. um but I can see how that would be a tradition, like, putting kind of Christmas and the holidays aside. I can see how that would be something that people would want to do. Just kind of get cozy, get kind of snuggled up and then start telling stories. And honestly, the best stories to tell are the ones that, have a ghost in them or some sort of, intrigue. So you can kind of see how that would naturally come about, um, and then just putting Christmas on top of it, because I can't remember if we talked about it in one of our last episodes, or maybe it was our last mini for our Patreon supporters, where we were discussing just the idea that, sometimes Christmas, it can get just a little too holly jolly, and you need something to balance it out. And, sometimes it's nice to kind of talk about something that's not quite as Christmassy as everything else is screaming in our modern society. Everything is sugar cookies and elves and gingerbread men, and it gets to be a lot. So yeah, I would welcome a tradition of inviting some close friends over and sitting around a fire and seeing who can spook each other out with the best ghost story. I think it's great.
Yeah, I agree. And when you sit and you think about some of the best ghost stories, they either were written to be told around Christmas, or they involve Christmas in them. Like all of Charles Dickens' Christmas tales. But at the Turn of the Screw, if I remember correctly, the frame is that they're telling Christmas stories. The Woman in Black, the frame is that they're telling Christmas Eve stories. The Elizabeth Gaskell's The Old Nurse's Tale, I think that's told around Christmas. And even stories that don't mention Christmas, it's usually a cold, dreary time of year. And, what is it? I think is it the night of Christmas Eve? I'm terrible with these astrological things. Is it the night of Christmas Eve or the night of Christmas, which is the longest night of the year?
I think it's the solstice, isn't it? So that would be the
So,
21st.
okay, so it's like right before that. Okay.
I think. I am probably getting that really wrong too, but
Yeah, we have literature degrees. We don't. But that seems pretty spooky to me, right? It's like the longest night of the year. Like
it
I could totally
is.
see people thinking this is like that time when the line between living and dead is really thin, or it is a long night to have to get through. You might as well scare yourself and all the people around you.
Okay, so I did look it up, and it is the 21st, the shortest
Okay.
day of the year, which I guess would by default make it the longest night. Uh,
Yes.
I do know that. Science. Oh,
Uh,
yeah, but well, in a lot of these stories, and I'm so glad we're talking about this today, and we're only going to touch on a few of them, because if I cannot revive the tradition of telling ghost stories around Christmas Eve or maybe the winter solstice, then I would at the very least like to get people reading some of these old, for lack of a better term, Christmas ghost stories. Even though, as you pointed out, a lot of them don't really take the holiday into consideration. It's just more that they were told around that time period. But I think we need to be talking about it, because people know when you say Christmas ghost story to most people, they're like, no, that's not a thing. Then you remind them of the song that you quoted, Mel, and they're like, oh yeah, why is that? And then you bring up, of course, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, and then usually people are like, oh, okay, I guess that is a thing. But there are so many more writers out there than just Dickens who are doing this. And so if we can't revive the tradition, then at least I think we should revive some interest in these writers, because some of these stories are great. And one thing that I love is their attention to setting. Every good ghost story needs a really good setting. That's why I think so many of them are in like an old English manor house or something. But as you said, Mel, a lot of these involve either winter weather, like a snowstorm, which is kind of fun, or just kind of dreary, gross weather. And more than a few of them involve almost library-like settings. There's a lot of discussion of old homes and studies that are stacked with books on every wall. And I love that atmosphere for a ghost story.
Oh yeah, and one of the writers that we're going to talk about is M.R. James, and he was an academic, which is
You can tell in his stories.
which is obvious in his stories, and a failing maybe that Lisa and I can both identify with. But most of his people will even find like forbidden knowledge or books, that kind of start out the horror. And so that kind of claustrophobic in a library doing research or maybe not doing research and stumbling upon like some person's journal they left about something creepy happening, or finding a bunch of letters, or finding a demonic scrapbook, or these various uh, various setups that he has. And there's usually a scholar, sometimes a medievalist like he was, not always. But he does a really good job of playing with the idea of putting a person who you wouldn't normally think of as being like into the supernatural, just kind of doing their thing. And they stumble upon these like really crazy, horrible, these crazy, horrible things. And he's writing in the early 1900s too. Um, and so ghost stories have been around a while. So the stuff that he does with his ghosts are kind of interesting as well, like making them physical and describing them in really like what we come to now to think of as almost Lovecraftian, like horror to it as well. Um, and he read his stories to other people on Christmas Eve when he was working on them. And so that's kind of, even though Christmas doesn't always appear in his stories, as you were mentioning, Lisa, they still have that Christmas connection to the point where the BBC used a lot of his stories for their Christmas ghost story miniseries that they did. I think it was in the 70s and the 80s. I think they did it, and then they revived it in the mid 2000s. But several of his stories were used for those episodes.
I haven't actually seen any of the BBC adaptations of his stories.
Okay, yeah, I just went ahead and Googled it because I wanted to get the dates right. So, A Ghost Story for Christmas was kind of like a mini series of short television films that the BBC did, and it was as it came and went, kind of over the years. It would be on different BBC channels, which is something someone who's been in Britain would understand, that we don't have all the BBC channels. We just have what BBC America. But it was in the early 70s. So the first one was M.R. James' Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, which is super creepy. And it was an earlier black and white adaptation of that story in the late 60s. And they had such success with it, they decided to adapt more stories. So it was in the 70s that they did this, one each Christmas, and several of them were M.R. James stories. And then in 2005, they revived it again. I'll go ahead and list some of the stories. The Stalls of Barchester was one of them, A Warning to the Curious, Lost Hearts, which we're going to talk about, The Treasure of Abbot Thomas, The Ash Tree, which we're going to talk about. And then they also did Charles Dickens' The Signal Man. And then when they came back, they were in 2004 and 5, they were all M.R. James stories. And folks who are familiar with the new Doctor Who and Sherlock would recognize the name Mark Gatiss. He actually did the adaptation for the last one in December 2013, which was M.R. James's story, The Tractate Midoff, which again is a young librarian receiving it like an ILL request, basically, for an obscure book with a creepy knowledge in it that causes problems. So M.R. James is kind of in the preponderance of our BBC Christmas fare. I too, Lisa, have not watched those. I just became aware of them through listening to Mark Gatiss interviews with my interest in Sherlock and Doctor Who, and now I really want to check them out. So I'm gonna have to look and see if they're on any streaming services or available in any way, because that seems like a cool way to spend Christmas.
It does. I'm really curious to see how they did Lost Hearts, because reading that story, it has such a vivid picture in my mind, and it's so creepy, but I wonder how it would translate, because the story starts out, this is another one of those stories where it's kind of a rogue scholar. In this case, like an elderly man who lives in this manor house and has wonderful books. In fact, there's a long list of some of the things in his libraries. A lot of Greek mythology, and there's talks of it. You know, in a weird way, it reminds me of Poe's The Raven. In describing like the bust of Pallas and all that, because it describes the different like sculptures that he has and artwork, I guess. And but the story is about this elderly man, the scholar, who a young orphan boy comes to live with him, who I guess is kind of a distant relation. And right away, you get this really uneasy feeling, which I think M.R. James is just great at doing. He sets the reader at unease very early on, and just tightens that and tightens it and tightens it until the end. And but with this, I mean, the first thing he says is when the older man meets the young boy who's now come to live with him, he says, you know, oh, how are you and how old are you? And then he repeats it, and how old are you? And just kind of a weird, it's the repetition of that asking how old you are that, I don't know, immediately in my head I was like, okay, this is going nowhere good, and it doesn't.
Yeah, and I love the uncanny of how everybody is like, isn't it amazing that he's taking in this distant cousin of his who's been orphaned? Isn't it amazing that he took in this other girl and this boy who were homeless and sick, and they just ran away for no apparent reason, but he's such a good guy. He helps children, and you're just like, no.
No,
There's something else going on here.
I mean, we know it. Well, and see, what I like this is about M.R. James, and we'll get to the ash tree later. But a lot of these stories, you know, of course, they like predate the modern horror movie. But a lot of these tropes, I feel like we've seen a million times. And this is why I'm wondering about the BBC versions. Because if I saw them on the screen, I would kind of yawn and be like, oh, that's old hat. We've seen that before. You know, kind of the idea of, oh, here's this man who's bringing in children. And children just disappear around him. And we don't know what's going on. You know, it's just obviously is not right. And the same thing with the ash tree, which I'll save until we get to that one. But, you know, if I saw them on the screen, again, I would just kind of feel bored. But for some reason, as I'm reading them, it has a fresh feeling to them. And so even though they've been repeated, I think it just shows his mastery of the genre.
Oh yeah, the way that he builds the tension and the way that he usually has the narrator at a remove. It's like it's somebody who's heard about what happened or read about what happened. And so you know partway through the story that this child survives. But even then, it doesn't lose any of its, you know, scary or creepy aspect. The weird dream the kid has where he discovers the bathtub where the guy that used to kill the children for his secret purposes. And then that I thought of the turn of the screw. I don't know why, but it immediately popped into my head when the little boy looks outside and sees the two ghost kids on the grounds looking up at the castle. It kind of reminded me of that moment when the governess is watching the children to see if they see the ghosts out on the lawn, you know, outside the manor.
Yeah.
And then right. you don't even see what they do to the man, but it's still terrifying. Like because the kid can't get the door open even though it's not locked, and then all of a sudden it comes open. And you're right, it's all the stuff we've seen before and heard before, but for some reason it's like it just seems to fit. And I don't know if it's the time period he's writing in. I think it has something to do with that kind of distance, like a storyteller type narration that pulls you in. But it works in his hands in a way that I think maybe, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if we could have a story like this written today and we wouldn't just, like you said, roll our eyes, you know?
Right. Well, you know, it might be the storytelling aspect because it does have that feel of, we're hearing this from the one who survived, and so it lends a certain urgency is maybe the wrong word I'm looking for, but it helps the story out, because especially in the end when you basically get to look at the old man. His name is Mr. Abney. I don't think we've ever named him in the podcast. His name is Mr. Abney, and the reader actually gets to see Mr. Abney's secret papers, and so you're kind of given the answers in these secret papers, which brings the reader into the story in a really neat way. You kind of feel like one of the characters at that point, getting the secret knowledge. But yeah, in any other story, I think I would have just rolled my eyes and been like, well, that was info dump at the end of the story. Like, okay, thanks for explaining it all to us. But when I first read this one, I had to go back and reread his letters a couple of times because I was like, did I read that right? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, what he's doing to those kids is horrific. I found myself wondering, like, could people watch this on television? Because you know how, what was it, Henry James, no relations, said that the turn of the screw that makes people more scared is when children are the victims. And this man is like cutting open children and trying to make sure they stay alive while he's like doing magical things or whatever with their hearts. Um, it's pretty intense, and I feel more creeped out in some ways by having that happen off stage. It's like it's the stuff you don't see and just have described in the letters that you imagine and you make worse in your mind because you've seen what the kids did to the man. It's like this selective pulling back of the curtain, just enough to get you thinking and kind of creep yourself out.
Right. Well, and too, that you really feel like you're reading one story until you get to the end and realize you're reading another, because it could be just a kind of deranged man, almost like a Frankenstein character, a Dr. Frankenstein character, in that, he's so single-minded in his pursuit of immortality, because that's what he's trying to do, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. He's so single-minded in this pursuit that he doesn't have any regard for the lives of the children. And so it could very easily be well, we just need to see this kid escape. We need to see him like outlive this man or run away from this man or get away from this man. And it could very easily just be that story. But then by the end, you do realize, in kind of a nice twist, because a lot of the ghost stories around, especially around the Victorian time period, the ghosts were pretty, what's the word? Passive, maybe, is what I'm looking for. I mean, they were there to kind of point you to the lost fortune that your aunt left you that you couldn't find, or tell you something about, but they weren't very interactive. These ghosts are, and it becomes this like very enjoyable, vengeful ghost story.
Oh yeah, these ghosts they have like, claws and they are mad.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
definitely are seeking vengeance. They will, yeah, I think that's one of the creepy things about James's ghost too, is that he uses the touch of the ghost in such weird, interesting ways that you're right. Like a lot of Victorian ghosts didn't really touch anybody. They were just replaying something or providing you with information or trying to communicate. His ghosts like grab people, smother people, poison people, stab people.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of physical interaction with the ghosts in M.R. James stories.
Yeah, there is. I mean, and I think that's one of the things that make M.R. James the kind of master of the ghost story. Because as much as I love reading, like you mentioned, Turn of the Screw, and I can definitely see the comparisons that you would make between this story and the Turn of the Screw. And I love the Turn of the Screw, and I like it for its ambiguity. But there's no ambiguity in an M.R. James story most of the time.
Yeah,
the
I can only think of a couple that are ambiguous.
yeah, but it's fine because it's so creepy and it lingers with you. It really
It
does.
does. It does.
I think we need to talk about the ash tree because I know this entire episode is not going to be about M.R. James. We want to sneak another writer into our discussion. But I'm really curious, Mel, to hear your thoughts on the ash tree because I will go ahead and say of these two, Lost Hearts is my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And the ash tree is interesting. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I love Lost Hearts. I liked rereading it, and it lingered with me from the last time I read it, which was a few years ago. But the ash tree, because I practically have arachnophobia, spiders with bodies bigger than a man's head
Yeah. Well, again,
crawling over your body
imagery.
while you're sleeping in bed. That I remember the first time I read the story, I remember where I was sitting and I was totally creeped out by it. In the end, when they're trying to kill the spiders, and the spiders, well, first the spiders kill a cat, and then they're all like just boiling out of the tree and crawling. Yeah, that totally creeped me out. But I'll give a recap of the ash tree for folks who haven't read it. And if you haven't read it, don't think just because we gave you the plot that you won't get something out of it. I do think you can still read these stories and see how he puts it together and get that creepy feeling. But interestingly enough, since we just finished our witches series, we have a witch in the 1600s, or a woman who was said to be a witch in the 1600s, who is executed, supposedly, but she possibly uses some sort of magic, we don't know, to be inside an ash tree, which is, there are lots of superstitions about ash trees and their powers and their connections to supernatural things. And so the man who accused her of being a witch was mysteriously poisoned in his bed, which is where the ash tree touches the window of the house in his bedroom. And then his descendant is also killed when he decides to change his bedroom. And then the next guy is also killed. And so in the end, you have the two characters who are like 2 or 3 generations removed at that point, who are trying to figure out like what's wrong with this bedroom where people just keep dying in it. And so again, they use the papers, like the journal of the previous vicar, to put together that it must be the ash tree. They think that the ash tree is like straining bad things or germs into his room or something like that. What they don't realize is that apparently the witch's body is in the middle of the ash tree and spiders are coming out of her, which apparently was one of the superstitions about witches, connections to pests. And huge spiders just keep coming out of the tree and going in and killing the descendants of this man when they sleep in this bedroom. So yeah, it kind of lacks the punch of Lost Hearts to a certain extent, but because I'm so creeped out by spiders, the description of them, when the people are seeing them crawl over them and not knowing what they are, really kind of stuck in my memory.
I mean, I can see how that would. I think I was deadened to the fear of spiders from, I know we've talked about this on the podcast, Something Wicked this week.
Oh yes, the spiders on the ceiling.
Where the ceiling cracks. And that to me is, I'm like, I've seen the worst.
That is true. That's a good point.
Bring it on, M.R. James, because I've seen the worst and I've survived. So no, but I think that is a good element to discuss because, and I think this is why this story kind of bothers me a little bit, and I wish I could have read it fresh, but I think modern day horror movies have ruined this trope for me, because it's like, it's basically the plot of The Conjuring, isn't it?
It is.
And I know M.R. James came first, but like The Conjuring just angered me so much that that I read this and I can't help but draw a connection between the two, which is not fair to James, and I'm sorry. Wherever you are, I am sorry that I'm making that connection, but that was in my head, and I just thought, no, you can do better. But this was, I mean, I would prefer to read this than rewatch The Conjuring. So, but but yeah, it's just, I think it kind of bored me a little bit, just the idea of, oh, okay, well, I enjoyed them trying to figure out what was wrong with the tree, and trying to understand, especially the idea of trying to find a logical explanation as to why everybody in that house, in that bedroom, would die, and then finding that there's a supernatural reason behind it. I do like that aspect of it. And as you pointed out with the spider imagery, M.R. James is just really good at making that ghost story atmosphere. So I don't know, if I was in the early 1900s and sitting around a fire and somebody told this story, I would be sufficiently creeped out. But sitting in my chair in 2018 and reading it, I just wasn't. But
I could see how your Conjuring anger could get transferred. And I have to say, James was not charitable toward women in his stories. If they appeared at all, they didn't really have much of a point, or they were just evil. And so the end of this story is kind of ambiguous, because it's is it really the witch's body, and is she doing this magically, or is this some weird thing with the ash tree? But yeah, I mean, the thing that bothers me with it is that he kind of, I got a dog next door barking. The thing that bothers me in the story is that he kind of just accepts that she was a witch and had evil powers, and she's taking vengeance on all these people. So I don't know. But again, that's me now looking back on it and saying, hey, based on all these other stories that were written where these women were treated this way and whatever, then you should be writing a different thing. So I don't know if I can hold him responsible for that. But he does kind of play into those tropes of accuse a woman of witchcraft. Oh my gosh, she is a witch and she's evil and she's going to kill you and every male offspring.
Right. Yeah. And that might have been it too. It's just the, that kind of distaste for when you read it, and you're right, it is a little bit ambiguous, but it's also kind of not.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, she was a witch and she was evil and she's enacting her evil even from beyond the grave.
I love the part where they try to dig up her body and it's empty grave, and they're just like, oh, what happened? Maybe it was a grave robber. No, she's a witch.
Yeah. There was a lot of fainting in this story too.
There was a lot of fainting,
and not just the women. I mean, so we do have to give him that. The lady out, faints, but also. Also, and it might have been when they were finding the grave empty. One of the men faints away when he realizes that nothing's there.
Yeah, somebody faints when the spiders are pouring out of the tree too, or somebody gets sick when the cat is attacked by the spider, and that was a man. So yeah, that's true. It was equal opportunity fainting and vomiting.
We can give him that. I do like that kind of halfway through this, and it's around the time when they're looking through the books and the papers to try to figure out what's going on, that they kind of pause and have a a dinner party. It's if you have to remember, you're reading an English story, and it reminds me a little bit of when we had our discussion on oh gosh, what was it? The Day of the Triffids, where
they had to pause for tea.
Yeah, there's always a pause for tea in the middle of the apocalypse, because they're English, so they have to remind you of that. And at one point, it kind of reminded me of that in this story, because they're all talking about what had been going on, and then in the end, they're going to stop and they're going to have dinner and wine and play some cards and then continue on with their little mystery, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, not doing that would just be so uncivilized, wouldn't it? I mean,
This was before the fainting away. Um,
See, if they had waited a little bit on the dinner party and solved the mystery, they wouldn't have seen all these horrible things,
right,
and they
right.
wouldn't have fainted.
Yeah. And this is, I think, before the cat, too. So, you know,
Yeah, that's true too.
I think
Yeah.
at that point, it had only been stories that they had heard. They had not actually seen anything. So I guess the party was acceptable. But that did strike me as very English and very charming.
You can't solve a mystery on an empty stomach.
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't know. I don't want to keep talking about this story because I just don't. But
What a nice transition
yeah.
there.
A plus. Um no, I mean, because we've been talking about women and how M.R. James does kind of give his women characters the short end of the stick. To some degree. I mean, there's a lot of testosterone in his stories, and often, as you said, there's the older male scholar, who's out to find the secrets of the supernatural, in a dusty old library somewhere. But a lot of these stories were written by women, and so we're going to talk about one in particular, Charlotte Riddell. Which I think it's important to talk about some of these women in the context of especially the Christmas Ghost Story, because I think Dickens, to a greater extent, and maybe M.R. James to a lesser extent, dominate a lot of the discussion. So you want to tell us a little bit about Charlotte Riddell?
Sure. So Charlotte Riddell was writing a little bit before James. So when James was publishing his stories in the early 1900s, Charlotte Riddell was nearing the end of her life. She lived from around 1832 to 1906. And she's a very interesting writer. Her stories have been published. You can find her stuff on the internet, but she's not as easy to find as someone like Charles Dickens or M.R. James. She published under her married name, Mrs. J.H. Riddell, though I think she used a pseudonym earlier in her career. When she was married, she decided to go with her married name, which was a Victorian convention. This was something that a lot of women writers at the time were doing. And I guess we can't really tell if her marriage was happy or not, but there were rumors about her husband having been at prison at one point, possibly for debts, maybe something else was going on. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that her husband was not really able to support himself and her. They were constantly in financial problems, so they were constantly facing debt, constantly on the edge of bankruptcy. And they made it through mainly because of her work. She was constantly working and felt like her writing was rushed sometimes because she was trying to make money to keep food on the table. And a lot of women writers, particularly around that time, like the 1800s, were writing to either support themselves or to help support families. And so, the myth of the writer in a room somewhere supporting themselves with only their writing is is something that writers have had to deal with for years and years and years. It's very difficult, to make a living, but she did for a time. And then after her husband passed away, she then became ill with cancer, and she basically died in extreme financial straits. I think she belonged to the Society of Authors, which was like a club of authors, and they would help support each other financially. And she liked to write. Interestingly enough, Riddell wrote social realism novels that had to do with the economics of the time and financial troubles that people often found themselves in, and was kind of calling out this idea of like getting more and more money and not taking care of the people who are working for you. But she also was a prolific ghost story writer, and she published several stories in the Christmas annuals. So Charles Dickens, I think we talked about this in our Charles Dickens Christmas Carol episode. Every year around Christmas, Charles Dickens and other writers would put out these Christmas annuals, and writers would write stories about Christmas. Some of them were just like little sentimental pieces or nostalgic pieces, or pieces about different Christmas ceremonies, and they would have puzzles in them because you have to be with your family, right? Like You have kids all over the place and everything is chaos. So you have puzzles or games in there as well to help out with that. But you also have ghost stories. And Riddle published several of those. And I think the one that we're going to be talking about is a strange Christmas game. Though I have to say, before we get into that, I think I shared this with you, Lisa, but I ran across a couple paragraphs from an article that Riddle wrote called The Miseries of Christmas. Where she talked about all the things she thought was wrong about Christmas and how annoying she found it. And this is a woman who is trying desperately to make a living and survive off Christmas stories, which I just thought was amazingly ironic. It's one thing to be a humbug and make your money off Christmas stories. It's another to write an article about how pissed off you are. You have to be around your family at Christmas. And how it's not as fun as people claim it's going to be.
I feel like she's the heroine at the start of like every Hallmark Christmas movie. You know,
she is.
like it's her job. It's her job to do Christmas professionally, and yet she goes home and she's like, I hate it.
Rampant consumerism. Nobody's truly kind. I think my favorite line in that is there's not enough kind and there's too much kin. I'm like, wow, that's sharp.
Yeah. Yeah. Not enough kind and too much kin. Yeah. Miss Riddle. All right, well, let's talk a strange Christmas game because I did enjoy this story. And we chose this one precisely because, you know, we discussed before that even though these stories were traditionally told around Christmas and they certainly were published around Christmas, a lot of them did not even remotely deal with Christmas at all. But this is one that actually takes into consideration the time of year and the holiday in a way that's really effective. You know, it does not come across as hokey at all, I don't think.
No, I enjoyed it. And it is that Victorian idea of ghosts who kind of show you what happened. Um, the plot of the story is this guy who has never had great finances, finds out that a distant cousin of his has passed away, and so the estate is going to come to him, and so now he has money. And it's interesting because it's him and his sister. So he and his sister have decided to stick together through thick and thin, even with their economic and financial difficulties. So they're pooling their resources, and they end up in this house, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to fix it. And the whole time, and this is a conversation for another podcast episode, but I'm going to throw this out there. The whole time at the beginning, I'm thinking about the book The Uninvited. Brother and sister get this house. They're excited and they're in the middle of redecorating, and then all hell breaks loose because of the past. And so what happens is they can't keep any help. They are like, they keep hearing this trumping around and banging, and people say it's the ghost of the man who died in the mansion. So I think two people have inherited the mansion since the guy disappeared. Nobody knows if he's dead or not. They assume he is. And the last person didn't want to stay in the house. They just left it empty. And so he and his sister want to live there because they have nowhere else to live. And it's getting increasingly difficult to get anyone to work on the house, to stay there with them. And they're not getting enough sleep, and they're getting cranky with each other, and they're getting upset. And so they decide to stay up in the two rooms that were associated with the man's disappearance, the parlor that he supposedly was in on Christmas Eve playing cards, and his bedroom. And they basically, on Christmas Eve at one point, I think it's like the first or second year they live there, they see these two ghosts, the guy that disappeared, Jeremy Lester, I think his name was, and the guy who was playing cards with him. They see them get into a dispute about the cards. They see Jeremy challenge the other guy to a duel for cheating. And they see his friend literally, like, kind of like, he stabs him in the chest, but is kind of stabbing in the back because he cheats in the duel. And so they witness this, and then they tell other people it was a dream. And then they basically kind of use that vision to solve the mystery. But yeah, I agree with you, Lisa, that I like the way that she used used Christmas Eve in the story in a way that, like you said, other writers maybe would write a story and they tell it at Christmas, but they don't put Christmas in it. I mean, it's in the title. It's the whole like they have to wait until Christmas Eve until they can even find out what happened, and it works. I think it's a really neat little motif to tie it all together. It didn't feel gratuitous to me. It felt like it could work in the universe of the story.
And I always liked that idea too. I mean, I like my ghost vengeful, which is probably like why I like Lost Heart so much. But if it's not going to be that type of ghost story, I think probably the other type of ghost story I like is this idea of like a cyclical ghost. A ghost that's going to replay the same thing um, over and over and over again, especially when it's linked to a certain time. Um, kind of like, oh, every time the clock strikes, midnight, this ghost pops up and does something. I've always liked that type of ghost story. I think it's fun. And for this to be connected to Christmas Eve, and like you said, Mel, for the characters to have to wait until Christmas Eve, which, I don't know, it's just kind of a neat thing. It's a neat story trick, and I enjoyed it.
I did too, and I like the inclusion of the sister. Like the sister was a fully fledged character, fully fleshed out character. And even though it kind of ends neatly with him, marrying the woman that she wanted him to marry the whole time, like I feel like both of their storylines get equal attention, even though it's told from his perspective. So I enjoyed that too.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. I agree. Yeah, Claire is a good character. She's and it is an interesting choice to have a brother and sister, I think too, which you don't see a whole lot. Normally it's a husband and a wife or friends or um, you know, just a single solitary man, for instance, inheriting it. But I like the idea of the brother and sister inheriting it. It's fun.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely kind of doubles down on family. And if I remember right, her story Nutbush Farm also has a brother and sister who inherit property. So it seemed to be something she returned to over and over again.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
This also takes advantage, just not even of and we've already talked about Christmas, but the idea of winter and snowstorms, blizzards. That's the word I was looking for. Where I'm dancing around it. The big white storm in winter. Um, it takes those kind of elements into account and kind of adds both to the mystery of it and the atmosphere of it. Um, because that's one of the things that kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast episode is that um, it really is. Winter is such a bleak time. No, I love the idea too because it's kind of expectation versus reality when you think about snow, right? We sing these songs like Winter Wonderland, and it's such a part of like Christmas lore of. My kids were watching Frosty the Snowman, the old cartoon the other day, and there was this whole thing in the cartoon about magic snow and how the snow that falls on Christmas is like the purest, and anything can happen because it's magic snow, and of course, living down on the Gulf Coast, we don't see snow that often. So for my kids, just the idea of snow is something really cool and exciting. But if you've ever been around like a real snow, you realize how quickly it can become kind of sinister. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. And that's one of the things that is really kind of played up in this because it's not just that this thing happened around Christmas, but the man who they're investigating his disappearance, Mr. Jeremy, happened during a snowstorm. And I don't know, it just kind of adds to it, this kind of creepy old manor house in the English countryside that's surrounded by nothing, and then suddenly snow comes in. I mean, it's exactly the setting of like The Shining.
It is. Well, and I think it's Matt. I think Matt mentioned this in our mini episode where he started talking about like, was it seasonal affect disorder, right?
Yeah.
Where your depression gets worse as winter progresses because of the sunlight issues. I'm not saying that's exactly what Riddle is talking about in the story, but I did think it was interesting that she traces their progression throughout the year. So these are people who like the claustrophobia that she creates and the fear not just of the ghosts but just in their lives is so real to me because you have two people who have come on hard times economically. They didn't even know they had relatives with money to leave them or an estate. They get it. They don't even really have enough. They barely have enough money to keep it going. They're afraid. They don't know if they can change it, but they do have some money that they can travel for the first time. And remember, they travel through Europe and it's summer and it's happy and he meets a new love and things are great. And then they have to come back to the house and their money problems are talking about what they're going to do with the house and everything's drafty and they're cold and they're just sitting there in the dark and they're alone because nobody will work at the house. And it's just like it's the feeling and the mood of it gets kind of worse and worse and worse until it's just like the two of them in this house desperately trying to solve this mystery in the cold and the draftiness and the dark and it's snowing and then they discover it and that just kind of really gets me too because you start to kind of identify with them and realize yeah like the weather and their isolation and their financial woes that they're trying to rectify with this new money and now this ghost like all of it like like everything in their life is kind of not going well at that point basically and they just want to solve that mystery and I thought the way she kind of put all of that together and really created an atmosphere that was really effective too.
I agree. You know what it really reminds me of is Peter Straub's ghost story.
Oh yeah, I could see that connection.
Because I think that that novel is kind of the inheritor to the Victorian ghost story in a lot of ways. Just because it, the way he weaves the story around the Chowder Society, and which is these four men who get together and sit around the fire. I think there's even talk of like this old kind of wood paneled library, in the opening of the book, but where they all just sit around and tell stories to each other. And of course, there's a greater purpose to that. And if you have not read that book, listeners, then I highly suggest going out and reading that. But he uses not just the idea of storytelling and telling ghost stories, but I think to a greater effect, he uses the cold weather, because snow and cold and ice, it all plays really well into into the atmosphere of that book and that feeling that you were describing. I think that Riddle captures of just how your problems can seem so much bigger when it's dark and cold outside.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah, it exacerbates all of those things. It makes you seem more alone and more and like things are worse than they actually are. Yeah, totally.
yeah, I agree.
And then
Well,
hopefully you don't have an ash tree next to your bedroom because then things will get really bad really fast.
though, maybe if that ash tree just, if that was an actual Christmas story, then that wouldn't have been a problem because, you know, I don't think the spiders would have come crawling out if there was a blizzard outside.
That is true. Yeah.
I don't know. I just think out of all the stories we've talked about, the ash tree is my least favorite. But and it might have been too just the timing, like you said, that we just finished talking about witches, and um, I left that discussion feeling that pretty fond of witches because I feel like it's a place where women can be powerful in a society that they feel powerless in. And then MR James just, let the air out of that sail completely.
That is very true. Yeah. It's unfortunate timing.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, Mel, I don't know. Do you have anything else to say about this Christmas ghost story, I kind of have the feeling that we can continue this on for a few more years because there are so many more writers of the Christmas ghost story that we could talk about. Why don't we
Oh,
just mention the
yeah.
two?
Yeah. Well, and you just recently brought to my attention, that there are now collections of Victorian Christmas ghost stories out there. So as
That's
long as people
right.
keep finding these things, we can keep reading them, and I love
Yeah,
that.
I'll go ahead and do a little plug for that. So Valancourt Books, they've put out now 3 volumes of Christmas ghost stories, and they're really fun covers. They're really good graphics, but they're kind of red and white and green, and they look very festive. Um, but they're all these ghost stories and these kind of holiday stories. I feel like there's some Dickens and Riddle and those sorts of people. M.R. James, of course. Gaskell. I'm trying to think of some of the other names I've seen in some of these volumes, but if this is something that sounds like you would like it, then I highly recommend checking those out. They make actually really good gifts too, I think.
They do. I can attest to that.
All right. Well, listeners, I am so glad that you joined us for this. I really hope that you take my suggestion, and this should be coming out on Christmas Day, so maybe after all the presents are opened. You can get by the fire, turn the lights down low, and instead of playing some Christmas carols, or watching a Santa movie for the umpteenth time, why don't you just either read some good ghost stories or try to outdo each other and see who can tell the best story? Because I think this is a tradition we need to revive, and I have faith in you guys. You can help me do this. So as always, thank you for listening. Happy holidays, and we will be back with you in 2019.